Can you all hear me? Is the microphone working? Is the microphone working in the back? No? You guys can't hear me? That's a problem because that's not the microphone. That's just you guys not having ears. All right, so my lesson topic that I was given, do not despise me because I am bold in my faith. So last year, my sophomore English teacher, and his name is Mr. Luce, we were discussing a book in class, and he looks up at the class and begins to speak about something. He tells us to think about when we're riding in the car by ourselves, and when we're listening to our favorite song, and we're singing it as loud as we can, by ourselves in the car. Then you pull up to a stoplight, you're still singing your favorite song, and someone pulls up next to you. Mr. Luce said to us that day, he said, you make a choice every time someone pulls up next to you at that stoplight. You make a choice about what kind of person you are going to be and what you are going to do in that moment. You are either going to keep singing or stop singing. And then he said something that hit the class very hard. He challenged every one of us to sing louder. And I don't think Mr. Luce knew this at the time because he is not a Christian, but this is so applicable to our Christian living, especially when we're talking about being bold in the faith. We look at it and we think, it is difficult to be a Christian when no one's watching. And it is important to be a Christian when no one's watching. But it's much more difficult to be bold in the faith when there are people of the world watching you. You have to be an example when there are people of the world watching. So today we're going to answer a few questions about being bold, and then I will leave you for the day. So the topic of my lesson today, as I said, is being bold in the faith. And the first question that we are going to ask is, what exactly is being bold? Because it's a small word, but it has a lot of meaning in it. So the definition that I have used for bold today is being confident and courageous. So today we are going to talk about how we can be confident and courageous in our faith. So these two things, when we combine them together, form boldness. We have to be confident and we have to be courageous. Now, one misconception about boldness is that it is not a personality trait that you are born with. You are not born bold. It is something that every one of us can attain and should strive to attain every day, to be bold in the faith. So, to learn how we are going to do this, we're going to look at a few examples. And the example that I was assigned with for this lesson that Connor had in mind when he wrote this lesson topic is Esther, and I think that's a fantastic example. So the next question that we're going to answer is, who was bold? So now we're going to talk about Esther, someone who was bold in the Bible. She's a fantastic young example of boldness. So if you would turn to Esther, we're going to spend most of our time here today. So if you would turn to Esther, we're going to start in chapter 2. In Esther chapter 2, the king is looking for a new queen. And in verse 17, if you would turn there, Esther 2:17. Esther 2:17 said, "And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti." So here we see Esther is put into the position of queen. And that is pretty much chapter 2 as deep as we're going to look at it today. There are a lot of other things in there that we could look at, but since we're just talking about Esther being bold in the faith, we're going to leave it there. Next, in chapter 3, we see in verse 1 of chapter 3, we see that Haman is promoted to a high position under the king. And this is important because Haman's going to become a lot more important in our story later with what he decides to do. And if you would turn to verse 13, we're actually going to see that right now. Esther 3:13. And this is Haman's order that he sends out. He says, "And the letters were sent by post into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to make perish, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to take the spoil of them for a prey." So here we see Haman has put out this decree where all the Jews are going to be killed on the same day. And Esther was a Jew. So now she is in a prominent position with the king. Haman is in a prominent position with the king, and Haman has now made a decree that all Jews are to be killed on this same day. Now, if you would turn to Esther 4, just should be on the same page, but Mordecai and Esther discover this plot from Haman. And then one of the most important things in Esther's journey to being bold happens. She has a discussion late in the chapter with Haman, sending messages back and forth between them. And this is what Haman says to her in chapter 4, verse 14. This is Mordecai speaking to Esther. In chapter 4, verse 14. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall there enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shalt be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? In the beginning of this chapter, we see Esther being a little bit reluctant to take a stand against this unfair legislature. And then we see Mordecai charging Esther. He says, this may be the opportunity that you have to help God's plan in delivering the Jews. Because Mordecai says, God will deliver his people. But it is your choice whether you are going to be a part of that deliverance or not. And then in verse 16, Esther says a very, very powerful thing responding. She says, go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. This is Esther responding to Mordecai's call to action. She says, I'm going to fast, and I want you to get other Jews to fast for me. This is her way of pleasing God so that she can have favor in his sight. And then she says that she's going to go before the king, which is not according to the law. It is illegal for her to do this. But she is doing it anyway so that she can deliver her people. And there is a high chance that she is going to be killed for doing this. But she is bold in the faith, and this is the first example of boldness that we see in Esther. And so then we continue to chapter 5, and we see in verse 1 through 3, Esther shows her courage, and she goes before the king. Chapter 5, verses 1 through 3. Now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel, and stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. And the king held out unto Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near, and touched the top of the scepter. Then said the king unto her, What wilt thou, Queen Esther? And what is thy request? It shall be given thee to the half of the kingdom. So here we see Esther boldly goes before the king, and she is rewarded for it. He is going to give her whatever she desires. Whatever she wants to request from him, he is going to give her. And Esther goes on to request that she can have a banquet where Haman is in attendance. And then if we continue, we're going to skip over chapter 6 and go into chapter 7. We see that Haman's plot to kill all Jews is foiled by Esther because she is bold in the faith. Esther chapter 7, starting in verse 4. Esther chapter 7, starting in verse 4. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondwomen and bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. Then the king answered and said unto Esther the queen, Who is he, and where is he, that durst presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, The adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. So here we see Esther putting her boldness on again and calling out Haman for this plan. And we see in verse 10 what happens to Haman. It says, So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's wrath was pacified. So this is the first step of Esther's boldness being fulfilled, is Haman's death. Haman had made a plot against God's people, and God has now paid Haman back for that. And now if we continue going through, chapter 8, we see there is a new law passed. Chapter 8. The Jews are now permitted to protect themselves. If you would turn in chapter 8, verses 16 and 17, and it says, The Jews had light and gladness and joy, and in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews because the fear of the Jews fell upon them. So the first step to delivering God's people is they now have a way of deliverance. And next we're going to see in Esther chapter 9, verses 2 through 5, it says, the Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king to lay hand on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. And all the rulers of the provinces, and the lieutenants and the deputies, and the officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter, and destruction, and what they would unto those that hated them. So here we see the Jews physically defend themselves, and Esther's boldness is completely fulfilled. The Jews are delivered from this evil act against them. So Esther succeeds, as do many others who are bold in the Bible. But we're going to go through a quick run-through of some other names who were bold in the Bible. Noah boldly built an ark when the time of the world was evil. Caleb and Joshua boldly claimed that they could conquer the land of Canaan when no one else thought so. David boldly stood against Goliath and slayed him. Daniel prayed boldly, knowing he would be punished for it. And we see many examples of the Apostle Paul being bold in the New Testament. So, now that we've answered the first two questions, what is boldness and who was bold? Now we need to know how we can be bold. Because how were these people in the Bible able to be bold in their lives? The Bible gives us many ways and examples in which we can follow to see this. So we must be bold to spread the word. So how can we do this? Well, I have three quick things that we can do to make ourselves more bold in our daily lives. Thing number one is pray for boldness. We can see examples of this in Ephesians 6, 18 through 20, if you would turn there. Ephesians 6, 18 through 20. Ephesians 6, 18 through 20. Praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, and watching thereunto with all perseverance and supplication for saints. And for me, that utterance may be given unto me, that I may open my mouth boldly, to make known the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in bonds, that therein I may speak boldly, as I ought to speak. So here we see Paul asking the Ephesians to pray for him to have boldness and to speak boldly. So it is okay and it is good to pray for boldness. Thing number two that we need to do. We need to surround ourselves with people who are going to make us more bold. Esther and Mordecai are the perfect example of this. You can turn back to Esther 4. When Esther and Mordecai are talking, Esther is originally reluctant to be bold before the king. But Mordecai helps her, and they talk through it, and she decides that she is going to go before him boldly. In verse 14, he says, For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise unto the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? This charge by Mordecai makes Esther more bold, and in verse 16, she decides to go before the king, even though it is illegal and she could die for it. And then thing number three, and this is the last thing that we're going to talk about today, is if we want to be more bold, we have to put our trust in God. And we have to know that God will deliver us. In Ephesians 3, 9 through 12, Ephesians 3, verses 9 through 12. Ephesians 3, 9 through 12. To make all men see what is the fellowship of the mystery, which from the beginning of the world hath been hid in God, who created all things by Jesus Christ, to the intent that now unto the principalities and powers in heavenly places might be made known by the church the manifold wisdom of God, according to the eternal purpose which he purposed in Christ Jesus our Lord, in whom we have boldness and access with confidence by the faith of him. So the third thing that we need to do to become more bold in our daily living is to strengthen our faith and trust in God. I have a few more verses for you before I leave you. Romans 8:31, if you would turn there. Romans 8:31. In Romans 8:31, we see another example of putting our trust in God and something that can make us bold. Romans 8:31 says, What shall we then say to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? If that doesn't make us bold, I don't know what will. We have God on our side, so we can be bold going out in the world and preaching it. Because if God's on our side, no one can overcome us. So today I'm going to leave you finally with the words of Mordecai to Esther in Esther 4:14. We're going to flip back there. I know I've been in that verse a lot. But Esther 4:14. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall there enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? When we see opportunity, we have to think like Mordecai is speaking here. God's will is going to be fulfilled, whether we're part of it or not. But it is our choice to be a part of that. And who knows whether we are come to the kingdom for such a time as this. The world needs bold Christians, and we have an obligation to fill that need. Thank you.